Λοιπόν, ας ξεκινήσουμε σιγά σιγά για να μην μείνουμε πίσω στο πρόγραμμα. Χαίρομαι που είστε τόσο πολύ εδώ after that lovely evening we had last night. It's a good thing that many of you are here. So it's a great honor and joy for us to have Professor Konstantinos Petrides with us as a keynote speaker. He is well known for his work in emotional intelligence, and all of us who are working at this field, we are reading his work with a sense of pride for our Greek fellow who is doing so well in this field. So let me say a few words about who Konstantinos is. He was born in Thessaloniki, here. I won't say the date. If you want to need, you have to ask me later, if you want to know. He holds a bachelor in business administration with summa cum laude honors from Pace University in the USA, and a diploma in psychology from the University of Nottingham. He received a master's degree in psychological research methods, specialized in psychometrics and behavioral statistics from the University of Exeter, and was taught by the first ever professor of psychometrics in the UK, Professor Paul Klein. He got his PhD, specialized in individual differences, psychometrics and behavioral statistics from University College London. Professor Konstantinos Petrides is the developer of the Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire. He is the director of the London Psychometric Laboratory. He is the first professor of psychometrics at University College London, the birthplace of psychometrics. He lectures internationally on trait emotional intelligence, personality, psychometrics, and individual differences. It's a great joy and honor to have him with you. Κωνσταντίνε, σε ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ για την ευγενική προσφώνηση. Καλημέρα σε όλους. Ευχαριστώ που είστε εδώ. Εγώ είμαι πολύ χαρούμενος γιατί είναι η πρώτη φορά που δίνω διάλεξη στην Θεσσαλονίκη. Έχω δώσει διαλέξη σε ολόκληρο τον κόσμο, αλλά πρώτη φορά εδώ στην πόλη μου, γιατί όπως ξέρουμε, ουδής προφήτης εν τη πατρίδη αυτού. Οπότε θέλω να ευχαριστήσω από καρδίας την Οργανωτική Επιτροπή και ειδικά την κυρία Πλατσίδου που με κάλεσε και μου έδωσε την ευκαιρία να πω ορισμένα πράγματα για το ερευνητικό πρόγραμμα σήμερα σε εσάς. Τη διάλεξη θα την κάνω στα αγγλικά, επειδή έχουμε και διεθνείς συμμετοχές άκουσα και για μένα είναι σχετικά πιο εύκολο, επειδή όλη τη θεωρία την έχω αναπτύξει στα αγγλικά και για πολλούς όρους δεν έχουμε ακόμα ελληνικές μεταφράσεις. Φαντάζομαι ότι όλοι, οι περισσότεροι θα είστε εντάξει. Άμα έχετε κάποια ερώτηση, μπορείτε να με ρωτήσετε μετά. Θα προσπαθώ να μιλάω και σιγά και μπορεί να ρίξω και κανένα ελληνικό ενδιάμεσα. Okay. Ωραία, έχουμε και ίντερνετ. Το laser pointer είναι εδώ. Λοιπόν, so, let me start by introducing myself in English. I'm Professor Konstantin Petrides. I'm Director of the London Psychometric Laboratory at UCL. This is our website there, psychometriclab.com. I'm going to be talking about a lot of research papers that we published over the last 20 years. The program has been going on for 20 years. And these papers are all downloadable from the website. So you can go to the website, download the papers, and also a lot of other resources relating to the instrument, the questionnaire, and other slides. So you can go to the website, psychometriclab.com, and download everything from there. So if I have the time, these are the three topics that I would like, the three areas that I would like to cover. First of all, I would like to say a few things about the theory of trait emotional intelligence. I'll give you an introduction to the theory and say a few things about its reach and penetration. Then I will focus on educational developmental psychology studies that we have run within the program and give you some results, or scientific results from the various studies. And if I have time towards the end, I'll say a few things about other classic studies that we have run within the research program, not relating to educational or developmental, but that they have become classic in the scientific literature. So more general studies. If I have time, I look at these. So first of all, let me just say that, give you some information about trait emotional intelligence. And you can see here on the left hand of the slide, you can see the number. I checked this a few days before I came. There are 500 records on trait emotional intelligence. So specifically on the theory of trait emotional intelligence, there are 500 records in the Web of Science. So trait emotional intelligence is now becoming a field of its own. 500 δημοσιεύσεις specifically on trait emotional intelligence, so which doesn't count all the publications on emotional intelligence that are not using the terminology. So there could be trait-i publications that are being presented under different labels, like emotional competence or generic emotional intelligence, but in essence, trait-i, with the trait-i references, the trait-i instruments. These 500 publications are specifically on trait emotional intelligence, and you can see these are the first publications coming out from a PhD, 2000, like one publication a year, and in 2016, 2017, about 50, 60, 70 publications coming out on trait emotional intelligence. And these have attracted about 9,500 citations. So trait emotional intelligence now becoming a field of its own. So where do the publications come from? Like literally all over the place. So you'll see, obviously, most of these publications are in psychology, as you would expect, but you will see that there are all areas of psychology. So you have social psychology, multidisciplinary psychology, educational psychology, clinical psychology, applied psychology, psychiatry, but then also trait-i publications in genetics and heredity. My lab has a lot of publications there. Neurosciences, in business, linguistics, obstetrics, gynecology. There's a lot of medical research on trait emotional intelligence being carried out. Nursing, family studies, sports science, all over the place. And it's very rare these days of specialization to have theories that really cut across so many different domains and areas and fields. So what explains, or what could explain, the penetration and relevance of trait emotional intelligence theory? You know, why is it so relevant to so many different areas and domains? Somebody might ask. And here I would like to introduce a very fundamental point about human psychology, something that is very important for human psychology. And this is the importance of emotions. So if we analyze, you know, most of the time we live our lives entirely mechanically and we don't analyze our actions. But if we start paying attention to our actions and our decisions and start analyzing them, we will find out that behind every single decision and behind every single action in life, there lie one or more emotions. So there's always going to be an emotional driver behind every decision in life, from the most basic decisions like picking up a glass of water, a bottle of water to drink, down to the most important decisions like, for example, do I want to get married? Do I want to get divorced? What am I going to study? What career am I going to follow? All these decisions and actions, if they're analyzed, right at the beginning, we are going to find one or more emotions. So the most fundamental emotion in human life is will, θέληση, okay, wanting. That's the most fundamental emotional dimension. And this gets progressively differentiated. Η θέληση, wanting, gets differentiated into things that we want and things that we don't want. Okay, but the things we don't want is also wanting, right? If we don't want something, that's still a kind of wanting. So we have the differentiation between wanting and not wanting. When we get the things that we want, when we get recognition, when we get money, when we get health, when we get children, then we experience all the positive emotions, happiness, self-esteem, contentment, fulfillment. And when we get the things that we don't want, like being criticized or financial problems or health problems, relationship problems, then we experience all the negative emotions, like fear, anxiety, disappointment, anger. So this is the entire structure of human emotion, right? I'm just giving you there. If you actually analyze, you have the fundamental dimension of will, θέληση. This splits into wanting and not wanting. Get the things that you want, you get all the emotions, the positive emotions. Get the things that you don't want, you get all the negative. That's how the whole thing works. And that mechanism, that structure, applies to everything in life, which is why you will see trait emotional intelligence research in obstetrics and gynecology, okay, γυναικολογική έρευνα, έτσι, nursing, rehabilitation, sports science, neuroscience, psychiatry, business. Trait emotional intelligence is relevant to all these fields, and it will become even more relevant in the future as people realize the importance of the theory because of this fundamental fact that emotions underpin every single decision and action in human life. So the formal definition of trait emotional intelligence is as a constellation of emotional perceptions assessed through questionnaires and rating scales. This is the definition that we're currently using in the literature from a very well-cited paper on which we have 3 Greek authors. Myself and Ria Pita, who used to be in the department here in Thessaloniki, and Flora Kokinaki from Athens. Trait emotional intelligence essentially tries to integrate personality traits, hence trait, emotions, hence emotional, and intelligence, broadly defined, hence trait emotional intelligence. Now, we don't see intelligence in trait EI, we don't see intelligence as IQ, okay? I suspect that most of you are familiar with IQ and IQ testing. We don't see intelligence as just IQ. We see it as a far broader construct that also includes things like wisdom and compassion and even happiness. So it's a much broader construct than you see, like the dominating approach in the scientific literature, which sees intelligence as simply IQ. This is from a paper now that was published last year in the journal Psychological Bulletin. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PsychBull? Not many. It's supposed to be the leading journal in psychology internationally, #1 journal. I'm not, I don't subscribe to this view myself, but it's a very difficult journal to get in. And last year we published this paper in Psychological Bulletin showing how trait EI, trait emotional intelligence, is the fundamental dimension behind human personality. So those of you who might be familiar with the Big 5 model, neuroticism, extraversion, openness to experience, trait emotional intelligence is the dimension that underpins the entire model. So it's the most important dimension, we argued in this paper anyway, that it is the most important dimension underlying individual differences in human personality. From my own lab, we do research in so many different areas, and we have publications in behavioral genetics. So we were the first lab to do behavioral genetic research on emotional intelligence in general, and I think to this day we are the only lab that has done behavioral genetic research on emotional intelligence. We have publications and research in clinical psychology, educational psychology, personality theory, in medical psychology. We've done a lot of studies with cancer patients and investigating the importance of trait emotional intelligence for cancer patients and cancer treatments. And psychometric research, all these papers you can download from the website if you're interested. in them. In parallel with the theory of trait emotional intelligence, I've been developing, because I am a psychometrician, I've been developing the trait emotional intelligence questionnaire, which I know that some of you have used in your research already. And this is becoming more and more salient in the international literature. It's been translated into over 20 languages and being used worldwide and commercially available. So just to give you an indication, I was told that we are connected to the internet now, and I don't know if I can... I just want to show you a partial bibliography of the TQ. I don't know if it's going to connect to my side. I'll give it a second and see. Okay, so it's not connecting. Anyway, it's not the end of the world. On the website, we have a bibliography for the TQ, lists all the scientific studies that have been carried out with this instrument. And if you go to the website and check it out, you'll find out that there are hundreds of studies being carried out worldwide with the instrument, with the various forms of the instrument. And this is a slide showing some of the commercial usage of the instrument, like in applied settings outside of academic institutions. In 2017, so that's partial usage in 1 year, and you'll see some of the companies that are using the TQ. Asda, which is the biggest supermarket in the UK, now they've entered into some kind of merger, and they'll become the #1 supermarket in the United Kingdom. Nedbank in South Africa is the biggest bank, or one of the biggest banks in South Africa. Bell Telecommunications in Canada, one of the biggest maybe the biggest telecommunications company in Canada, all using the TQ. So this is now the structure of the theory. Trait emotional intelligence can be subdivided into 4 factors: well-being, self-control, sociability, and emotionality. And then there are 15 facets at the lowest level. So we're at the lowest, most specific level, we have 15 different facets: happiness, optimism, self-esteem, emotion control, impulsivity, stress management. All these you can download from the website with explanations. These factor into 4 broad factors of well-being, self-control, sociability, emotionality, and these factor into global trait EI at the apex of the so it's a hierarchical theory, and it gives you a complete, comprehensive coverage of the emotional world of the individual human being. That's another way of looking at the sampling domain. Here are the facets again, the 15 facets with brief explanations. And it's another way of looking at it. You see global trait EI in the center. These are the 4 factors: emotionality, sociability, self-control, well-being, and the 15 facets outside. And that's yet another way of looking at it now. That's a circumplex way of looking at trait EI theory. Global trait EI is right in the middle, and you have the 4 factors outside in the periphery and inside the 15 facets. This is a factor structure that has been replicated cross-culturally in over 20 countries so far. So it seems to be a pretty stable universal factor structure for the construct. And these are some of the countries in which we have carried out factor analytic research and where the results, the factor structures converged. So you can see these are just some of the countries, and you might recognize your own flag there. So that was just an introduction, a little bit to tell you, what the theory is about and explain a little bit about its reach and usage. Now I will be focusing on scientific studies published in the field of educational and developmental psychology. So if I have time in the end, I might say a few things about other interesting studies that we run from medical settings and clinical settings, but now I want to focus on educational developmental psychology studies. I'm going to go fast, Okay, I don't have any time to discuss details, but if you see something that you're interested in, I am providing the references, okay, and you can go to the website, download the paper, and in there you'll find what measures we used, what statistical analysis we ran, a detailed explanation and interpretation of the findings. But right now, what I want to do is like a headline, like a quick shot of the various studies that we run, just in case one of them grabs your attention and you want to look at it in your own time later, okay? So I'm not going to be explaining in any detail now. So this is 2004 Personality and Individual Differences, one of the classic studies in the field of... So this has, for example, over 1,000 citations in Google Scholar. So that was one of the first studies that looked at the effects of trait EI on academic performance, if there is a relationship between trait EI and academic performance. And what we found here is we had trait EI, IQ, and we had English, maths, and science scores for 14-year-olds, as well as for 16-year-olds. Okay, so for the same pupils, actually, when they were 14 and when they were 16. So these are national examinations, English, maths, and science, academic performance when they were 14 and when they were 16. And we also had measures of trait EI and IQ. And what we found was, of course, that the direct effect of IQ on academic performance was massive. There was a massive effect from IQ into academic performance, direct effect, and there was very little effects from trait EI, showing us that the way academic performance is assessed, at least in UK schools, because this is a UK sample, is very heavily IQ-centric. And we discussed this in various papers in the literature, also in the British Journal of Educational Psychology. But the effect of trait EI was very small direct effect. However, when we looked at subsamples, when we looked at vulnerable students, so when we looked at pupils with low IQ scores, 2 standard deviations below the mean, as you can see there in that square. So these are pupils who have low IQ scores, okay, vulnerable students. For these students, high trait EI was a very big advantage. So you can see there, the low IQ, high trait EI group vastly outperformed the low IQ, low trait EI group. So high trait EI was a big advantage for vulnerable, disadvantaged students with low IQ scores. And we explain the process there, what we think might be happening, and really we think that trait EI gives an advantage to low IQ pupils in terms of allowing them to deal with anxiety, with stress, and giving them wider social support networks on which they can rely in order to improve their performance. So we discuss all this in Personality and Individual Differences 2004. If you're interested in underperforming or vulnerable pupils and students, you're doing research in this area, you can check out this paper. In the same paper, we found out that pupils with high trait EI scores tended to have fewer unauthorized absences, so they were less likely to be absent from school, and they were also less likely to have been expelled due to serious breaches of discipline. So high trait EI seemed to be a protective factor in terms of pupils' behavior in school. And in a paper that we published in 2012, we looked at, this is a similar paper now. Instead of academic performance, like before, now we're looking at socio-emotional competence, okay, like peer relations at school. And we are finding the opposite effect here in the sense that trait EI is a much stronger predictor of socio-emotional competence than IQ. So for academic performance, we found that IQ is a much stronger predictor than trait EI, because performance in academic settings, at least in the UK, is very IQ-centric. But when you look at socio-emotional competence, how well adjusted the pupils are at school, trait EI is a much better predictor than IQ. And this is discussed in this paper in 2012. This is now a paper from the British Journal of, British Journal of Health Psychology. Here we're looking at trait emotional intelligence and self-harm. Self-harm is very prevalent. I had no idea about this, but apparently about 25%, especially of female adolescents, engage in self-harming. So the statistics are very high, and we wanted to find out whether trait EI is related to the propensity to engage in self-harm. And what we found was a very interesting pathway. You see the adolescents with high trait EI scores were less likely to use dysfunctional coping styles. So when you go through adolescence is a very difficult period because the individual is growing up and dealing with all sorts of hormonal changes and all sorts of challenges, and a lot of people experience a lot of stress in the years of adolescence, the teenage years. Now, those individuals who have poor psychological skills tend to engage in dysfunctional coping strategies. So they are faced with stress, and in order to deal with this, they engage in they utilize dysfunctional coping strategies, like, for example, emotional coping, like throwing tantrums, or avoidant coping. Avoidant coping is when you bury your head in the sand and you hope the problem will go away. So these are dysfunctional coping styles. And we found that adolescents with low trait EI were more likely to engage, to use dysfunctional coping styles, and those dysfunctional coping styles led eventually to self-harming, because self-harming, like cutting yourself, is a way to deal with stress. It's used as a stress relief strategy. Okay, and this is a pathway that continues because individuals who utilize self-harm for to deal with stress are also more likely to engage in suicide ideation. So it continues, and those who engage in suicide ideation are more likely to attempt a suicide. And a small percentage of them actually is successful. So this is a fairly long pathway of dysfunctional coping, starting from low trait emotional intelligence. So these negative self-perceptions that we have, inability to deal with stress, inability to deal with the challenges of life, inability to understand and work with our own emotions, puts us in the wrong trajectory, in a pathway that is quite dangerous, because progressively we engage in more and more threatening and dangerous coping styles. Throwing tantrums, avoiding the situation, self-harming, suicide ideation, and so on and so forth. These are now studies that we run with children. This is a study from journal Social Development. What we did in this one, we tested about 200, I think the number was, 11-year-old pupils. We gave them the TQ, we tested them on the TQ, and then we asked them to nominate classmates on these 7 distinct behavioral dimensions. So we asked the pupils to say which of the classmates are cooperative, which are disruptive, which are shy, which are aggressive, and so on and so forth. And what we found was that pupils with high trait EI scores were more likely to be nominated for being cooperative, less likely to be nominated by the classmates for being disruptive, less likely to be nominated for being aggressive, less likely to be nominated for being dependent, more likely to be nominated for having leadership qualities. And now we're talking about 11-year-old children here. The similar study was replicated with Dutch data. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, if you're using the Guess Who and these sociometric methods, and you're interested in the effects of socio-emotional perceptions in childhood, these are very interesting papers. So this really is a replication of this one in the British Journal of Developmental Psychology published. This is another very interesting one. This is with ballet students in the English National Ballet School. This is extremely competitive to get in there. So this is very difficult to get into the English National Ballet School. And what we did in this study is we tested the ballet students and their teachers. And we asked the teachers to estimate the tratii of the students. So we wanted to find out whether there's any relationship between self-ratings of tratii and teacher ratings of tratii. And it was a very interesting sample because in the English National Ballet School, they work very, very closely together. It's extremely competitive. You don't have huge classes. It can be one-to-one tuition for a long time. So the teachers get to know the students very, very well. And we found in this study, it was published in Psychothema, a very strong correlation between self and other ratings of tratii. It was about 0.6. There is an entire different arm to the research program focusing on children. So the studies that I've just discussed now are with adolescents, but the tratii research program has a children's arm, which is led by my first PhD student, who is now a colleague at Imperial College, also Greek, from Cyprus, Stella Mavroveli. She's been leading the children's program for many, many years. If you're interested in tratii in children, ages between 8 and 12, you do very well to check out Stella's work. This is from the first paper that we published in the European Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, if I'm not mistaken. You can download from there, and you can find the first studies that we published on trait emotional intelligence in children, ages between 8 and 12. Very well received research. I don't want to go into details now, other than to say that another paper followed in the British Journal Educational Psychology, validation paper, showing the effects of tratii in children between the ages 8 and 12. And there's a lot more other stuff that I can't discuss in any detail at all. I have here, if you're interested, obviously, we continue to do psychometric work in all different areas. This is with the adolescent short form in the European Journal of Psychological Assessment. Behavioral problems, if you're interested in behavioral problems in adolescents, personality and individual differences, 2015, with an Italian sample here, showing the relationship between trait emotional intelligence and behavioral problems, all sorts of behavioral problems, internalizing as well as externalizing at school. Adaptations, Serbian adaptation, we published with Sonia Baniak and colleagues of the child form, because even now the children's forms of the TQ are being translated and used internationally. And this is one with Georgia Aslanidou. Georgia, I think she's here now, and a very interesting paper where we looked at trait emotional intelligence and drug addiction in parents and their offspring. And with a little bit of luck, this paper will be coming out either later this year or early next year. It's a very interesting paper, one of the very few papers that are looking at emotional intelligence in drug-addicted parents. So let me wrap this up. I'm wrapping up the educational and developmental. Obviously, there's more studies that I could have looked at, but if you go to the website, if we were connected on the internet, I'd show you how to do it, but it's fairly easy because you can go to the publications list and then you can click a button and then ask for only the developmental educational psychology publications to be highlighted, and you can find everything there. So let me just say a few things about other studies that we have run outside educational and developmental psychology that are quite interesting. We've done some work on gender differences in trait emotional intelligence, and what we found was that at the global level there are no significant because there's this stereotype that emotional intelligence is like female, feminine, and IQ is masculine, and there was this stereotype and expectation in the literature that we might find a strong gender difference in trait emotional intelligence. That's not the case. So what seems to happen is that for some facets of trait EI, okay, I just want to show you the graph here. There are gender differences for some of the individual facets of trait EI, like here you see. There are strong gender differences on facets like assertiveness. So if you look at assertiveness, for example, men and boys always outperform women and girls internationally. So we have data from all these countries, and you always find that men are more assertive. Men are also more higher scores on stress management. Okay. Also, they have higher scores on emotion regulation. So they score high internationally. When you look at the data from East, West, China, US, always men score higher on these facets. And women tend to score higher on facets like empathy, on facets like relationships, on facets like emotional perception. But what happens is that when you go to the global level of trait EI, that level there, these differences balance out. So at the global level, there are no significant, from a clinical perspective anyway, gender differences. There are persistent and important differences at these lower facets there that overall balance out. So that's some of the papers that we've run, some of the studies that we run on gender differences. Behavioral genetics, I don't want to spend too much time here, but we continue to be the only lab that has done behavioral genetic research on trait emotional intelligence. Actually, I want to discuss just this study. This is a family study. Here now, data from Croatia. Okay, so we have Croatian families. We went to Croatia and we asked them this. We asked adolescents to take the TQ. So we have the trait EI scores of the adolescents. And then we asked them, the parents, to rate their adolescents, the children. Okay, so first column there has the correlation between the father and the mother ratings. Okay, so the father and the mother have rated their offspring. What is the relationship between the ratings? Very little, as you see. So the perception of the father and the perception of the mother does not really converge very strongly. In the second column, we have the father-offspring correlations. So now this is the correlation, the relationship between the father's view of the adolescent and the adolescent's view of themselves. Ναι. So here, οι πατέρες κάνουν rate τους τα έφηβα παιδιά τους και κάνουμε το correlation μεταξύ αυτού του rating και το self-rating που έχει κάνει το παιδί. Να δούμε αν υπάρχει κάποια relationship, κάποια σχέση. And we find there's hardly anything at all. In other words, the father's perception of the adolescent and the adolescent's perception of themselves does not converge. Third column, you see the correlations between the mother's rating and the rating of the adolescent, and here you start to pick up a lot of significant correlations. In other words, the mother's perceptions, τα ratings της μητέρας συμφωνούν πολύ περισσότερο με τα ratings του παιδιού από ότι τα ratings του πατέρα με τα ratings του παιδιού. Αλλά, in the last column there, in the final column, what we did is we took the average rating between the father and the mother Okay, πήραμε τα ratings του πατέρα και της μητέρας, πήραμε το μέσο όρο και κάναμε correlate τον μέσο όρο με το self-view του εφήβου. Και εκεί βρήκαμε τα πιο ψηλά correlations. So in other words, the best predictor of the child's psychology, if you like, of the adolescent psychology, is the average of the father and the mother. So the father on his own doesn't do a very good job at all. Mother does a much better job, but if you take the average of the father and the mother, that's the best predictor of the adolescent self-perception. And that's all discussed in the journal Emotion 2008. And also then we have a sample of monozygotic and dizygotic twins, but I don't want to go into behavioral genetic correlations now because it's going to be a little too complicated. Trait eye and body image, that's another interesting study that we run in very well received personality and individual differences. So a lot of us are interested in the image that we have of our bodies. And here's a very interesting thing that we found. We found several results, but the most interesting finding was the relationship between trait emotional intelligence and this index that they use in the body image literature. They have this index, actual versus ideal weight discrepancy. How much our actual weight is, and how much this is an index that shows the discrepancy, την διαφορά μεταξύ του βάρους μας, actual weight, και του ιδεώδους. Πώς? Του ιδεώδους βάρους. Ιδανικού, αλλά από τη δική μας, όχι τι λένε οι γιατροί, γιατί ο καθένας έχει το δικό του ιδεατό. Πώς θα ήθελε να είναι. Αυτή η διαφορά μεταξύ του actual και ideal λέγεται actual ideal weight discrepancy. Στην Δύση, in Western societies, this index tends to be positive. Δηλαδή, we tend to weigh a lot more than we want. So if my actual weight is 90 kila and my ideal weight is 75, this index will be 15, okay, positive. What we found in this study was that trait TI is strongly and negatively related with this actual versus ideal weight discrepancy. In other words, individuals with high trait TI scores perceive smaller differences between their actual and their ideal weight, irrespective of the weight. So, ασχέτως με το πόσο ζυγίζει κάποιος, αν έχει high trait TI score, they are far less likely να έχουν discrepancy between their actual and their ideal weight. Okay, their actual and their ideal weight is going to be much, much closer for those who have high trait TI scores. This is an interesting finding. If you're interested in all this literature and all this the mechanisms and the thinking, the Swami et al. 2009. In personality and individual differences. Trait TI and communicative anxiety, I'm going to skip this, it's not very interesting. Asperger's, if you're interested in Asperger's and conditions on the autistic spectrum disorder, 5 minutes, thank you. We have a number of papers on that. In the journal Autism, in BJP, and more coming out soon, looking at the relationship between trait emotional intelligence and behaviors that fall on the autistic spectrum. EI and mental health. Now, this is a very big meta-analysis. I'm wrapping it up now because I've only got a few minutes left. This is one of the early but very big meta-analysis published 10 years ago. And you see here, this is interesting for several different reasons. What I want to focus on was, let me keep it simple and say that the relationship between the TQ, what these guys did is they looked at the relationship between trait TI and mental health broken down across many different instruments because there are many different trait TI instruments. And the best predictor was from the TQ. Showed a very strong relationship between trait TI scores and mental health. That's in the journal Personality and Individual Differences, a huge meta-analysis, very well cited, showing how important trait emotional intelligence is for mental health. In other words, to be well adjusted, to be well adapted, not to fall into depression, anxiety, and all these problems that are so common these days. The TQ specifically, the TQ was the best predictor of mental health, explained in this paper. Other papers, studies on trait emotional intelligence and vocational choice, showing how your trait emotional intelligence, the perceptions that you have about your emotions, how relevant they are to the career choice that you make. So what you decide to become, from the perspective of from the occupation angle, how related this is to your emotional profile. All sorts of studies on trait emotional intelligence training, whether you can actually optimize trait EI scores, and I've got in the website a special section for that, trait emotional intelligence, trait EI training. You can download studies that show effects on trait emotional intelligence through various training programs, including lately yoga training programs. You can download the websites, the various papers from the website. I'll skip this slide. These are some of the things that are reliably predicted by trait emotional intelligence. So correlates of the TQ. And now I'm closing, and in closing I would, obviously, you know, all these studies, there are a lot of collaborators internationally, and I'm not doing this on my own, very obviously, but I would just like to pay special attention to some of the students and visitors that have come through through my lab, and have now taken full-time positions literally all over Europe and beyond. You'll see, so these are either ex-PhD students or students who have come and spent time in the lab. A small selection here we have in Spain, in Italy, in the Lebanon, Belgium, Canada. We don't have anybody from Greece yet who has got a full-time post here, but I'm sure it's not going to be very long. So we'd like to close by thanking them for their contribution and thanking you all for listening to me so patiently. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ που με ακούσατε με τόση προσοχή.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε πολύ για αυτή την ομιλία που είχε μια επισκόπηση τόσων πολλών χρόνων, τόσων πολλών ερευνών και τόσο πολύ κόπου τόσων πολλών ανθρώπων. Υπάρχουν ερωτήσεις στο κοινό? If there are any questions, you just pick up your phones, your microphones. You don't have a microphone, αλλά you have a strong voice. There are microphones on in your behind your chairs. Good. We have some English.
If there's English.
People, I see them. So
okay, Konstantinos, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Konstantinos V.
Χαίρομαι που σας γνωρίζω.
Okay,
Ναι.
I used your take.
Σας ξέρω.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask you to elaborate a bit further about the correlation, the association that you have found between Big Five and the trait emotional intelligence. Because I have an invited symposium on adapting the short form of the Big Five questionnaire in Greek. And I would be very much interested in running a study, actually, giving both questionnaires to see what correlations I will get there. But I would like to have an idea before. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and it's wonderful to meet you face to face, because you've done so much excellent reviewing for personality and individual differences. Always very, very grateful for that. So this is a new line in the literature. I don't know if you are familiar with it. That's been emerging over the last 10 years on the general factor of personality. So there's this group of people who say that actually the Big Five are not uncorrelated. They're correlated, and you can extract a general factor of personality. So much like you have this general factor of intelligence, this G factor in intelligence, you can do something similar with personality. And I've been involved in this research because I find it a very fascinating idea. But of course, you know, this is cutting-edge research, and it's not received by everyone, accepted by everyone. But there's a lot of evidence now that you can actually extract this general factor of personality. And in this paper, in Psychological Bulletin, which is a very huge meta-analysis, 36,000 participants we had, we wanted to see, okay, this general factor of personality, what is it? Okay, can we find out what really is this very basic dimension? And that's why we wanted to look at it in relation to trait emotional intelligence, and we found this whopping correlation of 0.86. And we argue in this paper that this general factor of personality is a factor of adaptation. So in other words, whether you're well adapted or not well adapted. And from there you have all the differentiation. So basically, if you take the positive, socially desirable end of the big five factors, so low neuroticism, high extroversion, that all that correlates positively with trait EI. And if you get rid of all the noise and all the uniqueness, and you find out the core of this big five, effectively seems to be trait emotional intelligence. That's the point that we're making anyway in psychological bulletin. So we have to wait. It's like a fresh paper. We have to wait and see how it goes. But yeah, it's an interesting. Thank you for your question.
Is there any other question? Eleftheria Gonida.
Well, thank you very much for this exciting talk, really. I have noticed very well that we have identified self-motivation as an auxiliary facet of that emotional intelligence. Could you please elaborate more on that?
Yes, self-motivation. Thank you for your question. And I didn't go into this because it's a little bit technical. Yes. So with the factor analytic research that we have been doing, adaptability and self-motivation, they load on all four factors. So you see, like, motivation plays a role in well-being, in self-control, in sociability, in emotionality. So it's not like on its own. Now, it is definitely part of trait EI, but it cannot be grouped into any of the four. It cannot be grouped because it's part of all of them. So you know how important motivation is, of course, in everyday life. And therefore, in that sense, it's an auxiliary facet, sometimes we call it, or an independent facet, in the sense that it is not grouped under any of the four factors. But it's very much a core part of trait emotional intelligence. And the only reason why you don't see it under any of the four factors is because it loads on all four of them.
Okay, so it was
Yes, it's a core facet of trait emotional intelligence. The only reason why we use this auxiliary or independent is, people like to see, this neatly categorized thing, like things falling into places and everything pigeonholed, and they get very upset if something is just hanging out. So we just put them under this independent auxiliary kind of label. It's a very basic and a very basic aspect of trait emotional intelligence, because, as I said before, the motivation and will is extremely fundamental for the it's definitely part of the emotionality of the emotional world of the individual, and it's fundamental for our actions and decisions in life. I mean, motivation is behind everything that we do. I don't know, I can't get this to... Sorry. So yes, so this is what I was saying here, that the most fundamental emotional dimension is the dimension of θέληση, wanting, wanting. Everything starts from that. Everything starts from that, yes. No.
Please, is there any other question? Yes, please, Mr. Villioras, if I see well, because I cannot see so far.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My name is indeed Villioras, Yorgos Villioras. I was fascinated by this average score between parents, to be honest, that you created to correlate with the offspring, the adolescent offspring scores. And I tried to understand what kind of construct this could represent on a conceptual level.
No.
So I wonder if you have any ideas on that. Thank you.
Do you mean this study here? This is very interesting. Okay, very good. Very good question. And τώρα, μισό λεπτό λίγο. This one, you mean? Are you talking about this one? Yes. Now, of course, this is, that's a wonderful question, of course, because, what do these correlations really mean? The father's, how we approached in this paper, in the paper of emotion, because it's very difficult to know exactly what is going on when the father is rating the child and when the mother is rating the adolescent, right? You know, what do these correlations really mean? I mean, are they a function of how much time it's spent with the or how much insight they have, or how much influence they have? Now, we steered away from it's very difficult, and obviously with the kind of data that we had in this study, it was extremely difficult to say. So all that we were interested in demonstrating in this study is that there is some kind of relationship. And then we interpreted this as a possibility of genetic effects. Because if you show that there is a family relationship, now these are not genetic data on the left side. These are just like family data, they're called. So data from families. If we would have performed this study and found very little relationship, then there's no point in running an expensive behavioral genetics study. But if you run a family study, which is fairly, it's cheaper, let's put it this way, and you find significant effects, then you can ask, which is what we did in the same paper in study 2, are these effects genetic? Do they have a genetic basis? So study 1 simply shows that there are family effects, but we don't really go into the interpretation of these effects because it's very difficult. So thank you for your question. All that we say in this paper is, yes, there are family effects. Let's find out if there is a genetic basis for them. And then the answer is yes, and we left it at that. But it's an extremely interesting question to ask here. This family overlap, how can it be conceptually interpreted? Because the interpretation is not straightforward.
I think we have time for one more question. And then Professor Petrides will be available.
I'm going to be around all day today. From tomorrow I'm in Chalkidiki, αλλά σήμερα θα είμαι όλη μέρα εδώ. Οπότε if you want to come and chat and talk about anything you want, this or life in London or UCL, personality, individual differences, all that stuff, I'll be very happy to chat to you all day. I'll be here today. Don't hesitate. So,
okay,
yeah.
Last question then.
Good morning. Thank you for your great talk. My question is related with the developmental path of trait emotional intelligence. I'm here. Sorry. Here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry. The developmental path of trait emotional intelligence, especially in adolescence, is it tend to be stable, as is a trait-based model, or we can see differences through time, especially in those lower order dimensions, facets?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so to answer this, of course, we would need to have longitudinal data over a long period of time but of course, what we're finding in the literature is that trait TI very much behaves like a personality trait. So we would expect, and we do in fact expect it to show the same kind of longitudinal stability, which means that obviously in younger ages, children and adolescents, there's more variability, and also, as you rightly said, more variability in the facets, than in the global level, more variability there. But it tends to stabilize, and of course, personality starts to gel around the age of 30. And at that age, it becomes fairly stable. That doesn't mean unchangeable, of course. Because some people have this idea in the literature, or you say it's trait, therefore it cannot be changed. That's definitely not the case. But certainly, if you don't do anything in life, around the age of 30, if you don't do any self-work, any self-exploration, and you just leave things as they are, around 30 you're going to have a pretty gelled personality, which is only going to change either through a lot of effort or through life events. Because you have like a serious life event and your personality can get all... Yes. Thank you all very much, and I hope to see you around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.